Okay, thanks. Good. So, as Rob said, I teach business communication, business English, and intercultural communication. And in my opinion, when you teach English, it is very difficult to actually disentangle those parts. So this is why this is called Teaching at the Triangle of Culture, Language, and Communication. And we're looking into how much culture and intercultural training would English teachers need, not necessarily business English teachers, because I think this is something that creeps up everywhere when you teach a foreign language and English in particular. So what does that all mean? Well, I usually start my live workshops for trainers on this topic with a wonderful treasure hunt activity. So they have to find out what people think about those four things. And often we hear that language is the key carrier of culture. People express themselves, the way they're brought up, what they think, their opinions, their attitudes, which is all part of their culture and culturally coded in a language, usually in their first language, but increasingly in English. So that means whether you're a native speaker or a non-native speaker of English, the way you use the language is culturally coded. So there isn't really that much you can do about it unless you start reflecting. The way you are brought up in a certain culture, the way you use a certain language for certain things also influences the way you communicate. You could also say that your style of communication influences the language you use, and explain that a bit later. Of course, in particular in business, when you have far more encounters with people from other cultures, because business these days is international and you would speak English to people from other cultures, this is a very important issue as well. But as I said, it's not limited to business. I would also say that this is also true within one language. For example, the way Americans or British people use English is quite different. Even the way that Northern and Southern English people use English is quite different. The same can be said for other for other languages, like for example German, the way Austrians or Southern Germans use German is very different from, for example, my area, which is in the west of Germany. We have to remember, though, that 75% of international communication in English is done by non-native speakers, and that, of course, just like influences the culture part even more. So, the general attitude that I am usually confronted with when I work with language schools who ask me to provide training for them, or I work with companies who ask me to provide training for them, is that they say, well, it's enough to provide English language training. You know, they learn vocabulary, they learn grammar, and then they can go and do their job. It's often the case that they think intercultural training isn't needed, and it should certainly not be embedded in language training, and I heavily disagree with that. I actually think that what happens often is any difficulties, any misunderstandings are simply put down to language-based. My English isn't good enough, I have poor English skills, and I know that this is not true. So we have people who have a high level of English vocabulary, excellent grammar command of English, but they can't communicate very well because they've never learned about communication. They've never learned about the cultural coding of communication. So, for example, what my students are facing, and maybe this echoes with some of you as well, is of course we have Talcons. So my students here in Germany have Talcons with their American and Chinese counterparts. They have to make small talk, which is something that really scares them, especially when they're engineers and accountants. And they have to read these long and cryptic emails that they get from native speakers, and they don't understand a word. They get no reply to their own very short and concise emails. Then very often they're invited to a meeting or conference call, and they read all these 60 PowerPoint slides in advance, but they are the only ones who do that. And when asked in a meeting, then how do you feel about it? They don't see this as relevant because they say it's business, it's not about feelings. Then we have very long meetings that often don't have a result. So they feel very frustrated because they want short to the point meetings and they want results at the end. And when they give these long, complex PowerPoint presentations, they experience that people have low attention spans. And in my experience, this isn't to do with English as a language, this is to do with culture. This is to do with language culture, or this is also to do with business culture, communication culture, writing styles and everything. So we have to teach them as well. Question, how can we do that? So let's look at one example here, which is outsourcing to India, which is also something we have in many companies. So people have word perfect English in India very often, but they have an unfamiliar accent that my German students don't understand. Then my German students also get very upset because the way that the Indian colleagues use names is very different. So they say Dear Smith instead of Dear Mr. Smith or Dear Sebastian. Often people in India don't reply to emails, which is seen as a kind of offense by my German students, and they don't understand the different meaning of yes, which to an Indian often means I listen, not I know what to do. And these were things then that we had to tackle in our courses. So they had to learn about the difference in communication styles, and we really looked at the emails, we looked at the communication situation, and took that apart and focused on those things. So the best thing is, of course, to start with case studies, to take their emails, their phone calls, their meeting experiences, and have a look at those. So the BT cocktail, BT is the business talk, of course, is made up of those three elements: language, culture, and communication. And depending on the situation you're in, these things will influence what you do in different ways. So, however, I talked about the Indians, the Americans, the Germans, and the Chinese. What I also need to teach my students is, of course, the culture trap. Because in most books of business English, what you see there is that these kind of national stereotypes are perpetrated. So actually what we see is that it's always like you have the Saudi Arabian and they look very stereotypical and they behave very stereotypical, and that reinforces the stereotype that say, oh, I'm going to do business with people from that nation or that culture, so I have to behave like this, I have to behave like that. But thinking stereotypes can, of course, be very misleading because the individual that you are dealing with might be totally different. They might actually not be very happy with their culture and might appreciate the way the Germans do business or something like this. This is something I've experienced with Chinese colleagues who worked for a German company. So we also need to make sure that our students learn awareness. They learn that they deal with individuals, and they learn that they have to use interpersonal skills that go beyond the stereotypes of culture. So we also talk about transcultural skills. One of the most important lessons I teach my students is the individual is the enemy of the stereotype. So what do I mean by these three terms: intercultural, transcultural, interpersonal? Very quickly, intercultural defines the relationship between two cultures. Transcultural tries to move beyond that, coming up with kind of like general values that are important in effective communication. And interpersonal means between two people. And that is, of course, the people that you work with in international business. Let me give you an example. It is very often said that people who use a lot of words are very polite if they talk very indirectly, but politeness is an agreement of a communication framework. So I have a friend in Scotland, and 20 years ago I would have asked, shall we meet on Tuesday? And he would have said, oh, if you like. But he would have thought, but I work really long that day, I will be tired and so on. So I had to learn that when he says, if you like, it's actually a no. Whereas he had to learn that, shall we meet on Tuesday, isn't that he has to agree. So we had to redefine this. So today I would rather ask, oh, I'm in Glasgow, do you have time next week to meet up? And then he would suggest a day that suits him, and we would discuss this in a different way. So we both had to learn our communication styles. So this is what we talk about, for example, with high and low context. High context people use a lot more words. They're kind of hiding the message, as you can see here on the left. whereas low context people express things more direct. Whether they are polite or impolite depends on their agreement. No? Because I find, of course, low context messages are far easier to understand than a high context message, where I have to go to the end of the sentence to understand what they actually want from me. Okay, so that's some ideas about the problems you're facing in your classroom, because it's not enough to teach the language. You have to be aware of communication strategies and cultural issues. So I'd like to close off with some ideas of what has to be done. I actually think that trainers need more support and awareness to include those aspects in teaching. I also think that companies and schools must be willing to pay more for this, because we provide an extra service, we provide an extra quality, and often we go for extra qualification. I would also say move intercultural training away from the country trap, and be aware that being word perfect doesn't make great communicators across culture. So that's it from me. That's 10 minutes on why culture is important in business English teaching.